on developing a an ideology. What is an ideology? Yes. When it comes to the African American, the ideology of an African in America. The dictionary defines an ideology as a systematic scheme or coordinated body of ideas about human life or culture. A This definition seems to equate. It seems to equate to an ideology or equate an ideology with a philosophy. The battleground is ideological. Is ideological. The war is psychological when it comes to over one's philosophical views, or it is considered to be a social theory. However, in its common use, the word has additional connotation of commitment, both emotional and intellectual, of action orientated, the maintenance of the status quo, which may be the goal of conservative ideologies, is in itself an action, even of conscious or unconscious distortion of facts to fit the pre-established doctrine. The doctrine and ideology, emotional and intellectual, philosophical, and I equate with an ideology or a social theory. It is said that when it comes to the African American, that the birth of the African American culture, a book, an anthropological perspective, Sidney W. Mitz and Richard Price. Chapter 2 talks about the social cultural contact and flow in slave society. The reason why I brought this up in regards to the ideology of an African American, I was listening to someone talk about uh, the history of a particular group of people in India and how you get to a certain age in life and they define that to be manhood. And then I also realized that psychosocial dislocation, if I may use it, of the African American and the African abroad, and the struggle is that here in Africa, in the African American who has been enslaved, uh, went about trying to prove his or her, manhood or womanhood. There were signs that was saying basically, really, I am a man, I am a man. And I have a right to be treated as a man in the 60s. A right to be treated as a decent human being. And in Africa, it was the right for self-determination. Right for self-determination. I believe it was Garvey who talks about that he does not, we should not relish, in the past, And I realize that the past is just a reference point. It's not a place of residence. And in the book Race First, I know I didn't go into the second chapter of the book, The Birth of the African American Culture. I'm going to go back to that, a little bit of that chapter. It says that Garvey went about trying to convert the disabilities of race into a positive tool of liberation with a thorough aggressiveness. He says, no man convinced me contrary to my belief, he declared, because my belief is founded upon hard and horrible experience. Hard and horrible experience. So it is the experience. And he says not a personal experience, but a racial experience. So what is the experience that we have here in this shores of North America? It's personal, it's racial, political, social, economic, educational, the institutional, or the institution of the experience, this what Garvey would associate horrible experience, but he says it's founded upon in converting the disabilities of race into a positive tool of liberation with a thorough aggressiveness. So no man can convince me contrary. It sounds like his inability to disconfirm could be associated with distorted thinking. That he cannot be refuted. And it's based on not a personal experience, but a racial experience. We know there is no such thing as a race. You think about that. Say the world has made being black a crime, and I have felt it in common with men who suffer like me, and instead of making it a crime, but I hope to make it a virtue. He goes on to say, indeed, practically every aspect of the organization was designed to bolster the black man's self-esteem and to foster pride in self. So it is an esteem issue. I think it's a matter of trying to instill self-confidence. Still talking about an ideology, An ideology. It says that Garvey's interests in black history differ from one important respect from the social cultural naturalists. Some cultural naturalists to whose school of thoughts is sometimes linked, for he avoided the pitfalls of living in the past. The past is just a reference point, as I always say, not a place of residence. He used history to establish a grievance. It is known that out of the educational system of the African American, Out of their grievance became their educational system. Instill black pride and point a way for reverential race emancipation. And that was all. He refused to glory in the past to the extent of letting his refused to glory in the past and letting its exoticism become a hindrance to the struggle of his time. Trying to find relevance, importance. Back to chapter 2 in the book, The Birth of the African American Culture, an Anthropological Perspective. The distinction between culture and social in a social perspective. Trying to deal with this ideology because there is a distinctiveness that one must be able to identify with as being African in America. I've learned that have we Africanized ourselves for American, or have we Americanized ourselves for Africa? Well, you make the distinction. This culture and social perspective returns us to difficulties created by an overtly holistic view of culture. It goes on to say, we have emphasized the extent that we believe that the slaves were confronted with the need to create new institutions. Dr. Du Bois talks about independent intelligentsia. Yes, and I believe Wade Knowles talks about in psychology, creating something that is distinctively that applies to the people of the African American, confronted with new institutions to serve everyday purposes. It says we are defining institution as any regular or orderly social interaction. So in developing an ideology, it has to do with our social interaction skills and the manner and the way and the means in which we socially interact with one another. It acquires a normative character, and character is the outgrowth of one's humanity. So it sounds like in establishing an ideology here, in our own ideology, is we have to go through a resocialization process. Because remember that we also, as we came here, and some say that we were here, either or how you want to put it, is that there was a resocialization process. New ideas and new norms and new way of life and new ways of thinking. And this normative character and can be hence be employed to meet current needs, to meet recurrent needs, thus broadly define a particular form of marriage, particular religious code, a particular pattern for establishing friendships, particular economic relationships that is normative and reoccurring, and all would be examples of institutions. There are some group of people called the Amish, and one time they wouldn't, participate in the banks unless they know how to leverage and use what the purpose of using, the banks. You just didn't venture into it because, we have student loans and all this other stuff that comes with it. Then it creates a form of bondage. But if you are organized, you will be less dependent on others and more dependent on ourselves. And maybe that could be something that deals with self-reliance. Yes, self-reliance. So if there is a ideology that many Africans may have overlooked here in America, being enslaved. It must have to deal with commerce. It must be a commerce approach. Yes. And I think S.B. Fuller, he knew the importance of commerce, and there are many folks who are still present today know the importance of commerce. And then you have to deal with conscious. What are we conscious of and conscious about? And that takes on the form of being competent. Competent. Yes. And then you have to, when you deal with consciousness, you have to deal with, in commerce, you have to deal with Paul Coffey. Yeah, Paul Coffey, the shipbuilder, or the boat builder. And what is said about Paul Coffey? Let's see. In brother, in the book by Dr. If I can find it, Dr. Clark. What does he say about Paul Coffey? Okay. He says that he considered Paul Coffey to be the father of consciousness. Yeah. Because if he was building boats, and we know the importance of boats, is when you're able to set sail and sail the sea. You're able to trade. He says that since Paul Coffey's time, 1759 to 1817, concentrated efforts by the African Americans to achieve equality in America have been accompanied by an increase in dialogue about Africa. Paul Coffey among Black Americans is considered to be the father of African consciousness movement. The African consciousness movement was developed partly from his ideas. He was responsible for the resettlement of large number of Black Americans in Sierra Leone and Liberia. He founded the Friendly Society for the Immigration of Free Blacks from America. He was the sea captain who used his personal funds to return Africans to the motherland. And Dr. King talks about the rising tide of consciousness. These are factors, and he says for the Negro, the first was to mention that the population grew out from the isolated rural plantation, and outside their geographical boundary, they had little contact. That means once he went outside of that, his outlook on life changes. He talks about the second has been the rapid educational advances. And after that, the third says a new sense of pride improved on his economic status. Another factor in the census, new sense of pride, and he deals with the Supreme Court decision. outlying segregation in public schools. Because adequate cooperation leads to proper communication. That's how you effectively coordinate your power. So you must have adequate tools to work with, and the tool that we have to work with is the proper use of our faculties. And after we learn that, and it create a buoyancy of hope, and then must give account for this new sense of dignity, this new sense of pride. It must be instilled in others who want it, like yourself. Just trying to develop a ideology of emerging logic and emotion, philosophy with the ideology, and emotional with the intellectual, and doing things within reason and put it in a system that benefits the African American in helping them with their need. And the need is to continue to restore the dignity and self-pride and the self-esteem that one needs to continue on this journey to development of one's intellect for the betterment of humanity.